All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Athrea Mothur. I work as the Director of Legal Research at the Center for Art Law, and I'm so excited to welcome you to our Art Law Colloquium on Provenance Research and the Law. And before I introduce our wonderful speaker for today, and as per usual, let me let you know a little bit more about the Center for Art Law and what we do. You will also see a poll that is going to launch very soon. We would just love to learn more about you, where you're tuning in from as well. But the center, we are a Brooklyn-based research and education nonprofit, and we are dedicated to offering resources and programming to advance the arts and law community. So through our website, our newsletter, our events, we disseminate information and we try to keep our audience updated on everything art law, whether it's news, programs, cases, movies, podcasts, and a lot more. We also facilitate tons of conversations by hosting and participating in programs such as ours today. And of course, this doesn't begin to describe everything that we do, so we invite you to subscribe to our newsletter if you haven't already to receive updates. I'm also really excited to share that last year we published our first edition of our report on anti-money laundering regulations and the art market, and we actually collected very detailed survey responses from various AML experts across 14 jurisdictions. We also submitted a public comment to the Copyright Office regarding artificial intelligence, and we have a lot more planned research-wise and event-wise for 2024. And you can read these studies on our website under our resources as well. You may also consider becoming a premium member with the center, so you can have different offers and discounted access to our events, as well as access to our case law corner articles and the recordings of all of our past events. And we do have a good number of these coming up. We have a workshop on evidence gathering for cultural heritage crimes. We have a workshop on insurance for art collectors. We also have a clinic on legacy and estate planning, and we are extremely excited to be launching our first copyright clinic in April. If you would like to know more, particularly about these events or the clinic, the copyright clinic, please reach out to me. We are looking for volunteer attorneys as well for the copyright clinic. A few of the general housekeeping items for today. The program is being recorded for archival purposes, but we would love to see you, so please feel free to keep your cameras on, but your microphones muted for the time being. We will also be sharing the recording as well as a handout for the session during the event and after the event. If you have any questions for our speakers, we will be having a question and answer session later. So you can put them in the chat box below. And we really do invite you to send in your questions. We always appreciate an interactive and engaging session. Now, finally, introducing our speaker for today. I am really happy to welcome Meghan Bill. Meghan works as the coordinator of Provenance Research at the Brooklyn Museum. And as the primary provenance researcher, she investigates the histories of works in the permanent collection and strives to make that research more inclusive and transparent. She's also taught provenance research and ethical concerns for museums to museum professionals, not-for-profit boards, trustees, and students of all levels. And it's also really exciting to mention that she is a law student and a JD candidate at Fordham University right now as well. Now, without any further ado, I will hand it over to you, Meghan. Thank you so much for being here with us today. We're all so excited to hear from you. The Zoom screen is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Athrea. I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me one second. All right. Can somebody let me know if this is viewable?
All good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, good morning, evening, afternoon to everybody who's here. I'm so excited to be here virtually with all of you. As you know, my name is Meghan Bill. I'm the coordinator of Provenance at the Brooklyn Museum, and I am a 3L evening division JD candidate at Fordham University School of Law. And I'm very excited to be here with you all to talk about provenance research and how it intersects with legal and ethical aspects of caring for museum collections. So I will start off by just saying that the insights I'm sharing today are coming from about 10 years of working with the Brooklyn Museum's collection, but they are entirely my own. And with that, we'll get started. So just to ground us, I know provenance is probably familiar to a lot of you on this call, but it helps to have shared definitions. So provenance is the history of a work following its creation, including its past owners or caretakers, and how it changed hands over time and from place to place. For my work at the museum, I like to say that provenance is an object's life story from maker to museum. And understanding a trajectory of any one object, just like any other person, every object has a unique story, and trying to unpack and understand that story requires a lot of research. And it's not just the facts of an object's history that provenance researchers look at, but also the social, cultural, ethical dimensions of the periods, places, and peoples that have intersected and crossed paths with the work. So legally speaking, law is why we're all here today. Provenance research can help corroborate ownership. It can help validate a work's authenticity, and it can even help facilitate repatriation. But for museums, it can also help staff make more thoughtful decisions about how to care for works and how to share more informed and engaging stories about the works in their care. So provenance research is by no means a new practice, but increased public and professional calls to re-examine collecting histories have encouraged many museums to bolster their commitments to provenance research. So in 2021, the Brooklyn Museum joined a handful of US institutions with a full-time permanent provenance researcher on staff. So my role at the museum is to establish provenance research policies that reflect 21st century professional, legal, and ethical norms, to work to ensure that those policies are being followed, and of course, to conduct provenance research on the museum's collections. So unlike independent provenance researchers who may work for many clients on a small group of objects, or auction house researchers who work on very time-sensitive projects, museum provenance researchers have the luxury of getting to know one collection deeply over time. So admittedly, my purview covers nearly 500,000 objects that have been collected over 200 years, including works dating from antiquity to the present and from all over the world. But luckily, because I work at a museum, I can rely on a team of expert colleagues, including curators, registrars, and conservators. I also have access to many valuable resources in-house, not least of which is generations of past employees' provenance research. But the nature of my role also means that I get to spend time exploring not just the histories of individual artworks, but also the webs of relationships in which they have become embedded over time. And this is really a value that by being situated in one institution, we get to dig a little bit deeper, but I think a lot of people who do provenance research usually do. So museum provenance research tends to cover three main categories of works. With our curatorial team, I research all proposed acquisitions to determine the provenance history and corroborate that the donor or vendor has good title. This means examining receipts, wills, export permits, customs clearance forms, or other documents. And if names or gaps in provenance raise some red flags, such as a known dealer of looted antiquities, then it may be cause for further scrutiny. We might even go so far as to deny the acquisition until we have further information. I also occasionally work to corroborate provenance information for proposed deaccessions. This primarily means corroborating title, as well as checking that there are no restrictions on the work in question, such as restrictions regarding deaccessioning. But largely, the work that I do at the Brooklyn Museum is concerned with researching the museum's permanent collection. As I said earlier, the Brooklyn Museum holds nearly 500,000 artworks, many of which have already had their provenance research, but maybe that information hasn't been centralized in our database. Others have been researched already, but that research needs revisiting because new sources have come to light. But many, many more have had next to no research done. So I'm often asked how I prioritize my research because after all, I am only one person. And the answer is largely practical. So the The Brooklyn Museum includes provenance on all of its exhibition labels, which means that works going on view take high priority for research. Works that are going on loan also take priority, particularly because proof of provenance is usually required to grant immunity from seizure. And requests to return a work to an original community, also known as repatriation, also take provenance research priority. And finally, at the Brooklyn Museum, we've prioritized three main types of objects that merit intensive provenance research. And these are antiquities, works acquired during colonial contexts or otherwise during periods of duress, and works with gaps during World War II. And more on those categories later. Occasionally, I will also research works coming into the museum on loan for temporary exhibitions. The museum's recent exhibition, It's Problematic, Picasso According to Hannah Gadsby, included many European artworks that were made prior to World War II. We knew at the outset that provenance research would be a priority for the exhibition, so I worked with our lenders to research all the works going on view, and with their permission, we were able to share this provenance information with our audience via the exhibition labels. So in general, provenance researchers are searching for documentation for a work's history and trying to corroborate that information as much as humanly possible. Provenance research usually starts, unsurprisingly, with what you know or what you've been told and works backward in time. So at the Brooklyn Museum, we might look and ask questions like, from whom did we acquire the work and how? What provenance information was given to us, if any, at the time that we acquired it? Was the work ever exhibited or published, and do we have catalogs? And what can the work itself tell us about its own history? And so from this information, we then work to try to corroborate it, as I said, from as many different sources as possible. If, for example, a donor says that the work was sold at a certain auction, we will try to find a copy of that auction catalog. If a vendor claims that the work was formerly in the collection of someone, we'll work to see if there are publications of that collection or photographs of the collector's home. If a gallery is still operating or transaction participants are still alive, we will contact them to ask what records they retained or what they remember. And so what follows is frankly a very organic process of following leads, confirming or eliminating hunches, and retracing the steps of the research that we've already done when new information has come to light. So the research process will differ depending on the work, but can include researching known collectors or sellers of the artist or the type of work. It can include, again, possible exhibition and publication history to see if the work was exhibited or published. It can include known inventories of certain kinds of work. And if there are gaps during red flag periods, it may include turning to various looted art databases to confirm that the work wasn't confiscated, stolen, or otherwise illicitly trafficked. And finally, it's worth noting that provenance research is rarely ever complete or done. You know, there's a common misconception that I have heard a lot that once provenance research due diligence has done, then that's kind of like, that's the museum doing its due diligence and it's over. And that's really not the case. You know, new information is constantly surfacing as more archives are becoming available or as more archives are being digitized, as more scholars publish new work, and as museums are publishing more of their provenance online. So if there's one thing you can take away from today, it's that provenance research is never done. So ideally, a provenance researcher is trying to corroborate a work's full history from the artist to the present day. And a complete provenance narrative is common with contemporary art acquisitions because those transactions are fresh in the mind of the participants. But complete provenance history is not impossible for older works. For example, we're fortunate to know that this work by Giovanni della Robbia was commissioned from the artist around 1520 and purchased in 1898 from the descendants of the commissioners. Because the work stayed on the family's villa for 400 years, we have a complete provenance for it. Now, I want to say that this is far and away the exception rather than the norm. Provenance research rarely uncovers complete chains of title, especially the farther back in time you go. Much more often, records are filled with gaps and uncertainties because, you know, people forget things, or they pass away without leaving a record, or they move and they lose their receipts if they ever had them to begin with. And this is one reason why provenance research is really difficult, especially when we're talking about works that are hundreds of years old. So if there's another thing you can take away, one thing I like to say is that the one constant in provenance research is that it usually raises more questions than it does answers, which is both why I find it so interesting and hopefully why I will never be out of a job. But so before diving into how provenance intersects with the legal and ethical issues of collections management, I want us to walk through some of the sources that provenance researchers rely on. So one of the first places that a researcher might look to investigate provenance is the work itself. Labels and inscriptions can contain really valuable information about a work's historical circumstances. Here's an example of a spirit figure purchased in Mayagama village in Papua New Guinea by journalist John W. Vandercook. So the label tells us that Vandercook purchased the work on November 13th, 1933, for 3 sticks of tobacco and a quantity of beads. This is, in essence, a receipt, and the transaction is corroborated by Vandercook's account of his travels. Paintings are often full of information on the reverse of their canvases or their frames. The rectangular stamp on this work here, for example, tells us that this was part of the artist's estate. A few years after the artist's death, it was consigned from her estate by a New York gallery who sold it to a collector who bequeathed it to the museum. And as an aside, I will just say that labels offer one of the most vexing subjects of provenance research. I'm always delighted to find a label on the back of a painting or on the underneath of a ceramic because it offers a clue to the work's history. But if the label isn't obvious about its purpose or design, it can be tantalizingly unclear. For example, there's a label on the upper right-hand corner of this work that if you minimize the video screen, you might be able to see. There are several labels like this that appear on other Munter works, one of which is in our collection and a number of which are elsewhere, but we don't yet know what it refers to. It could be from an exhibition or a collector's personal inventory system or something else entirely. Thankfully, a few intrepid researchers are compiling databases of collector, gallery, and auction house labels, but in my experience, labels usually offer more questions than they do answers. Unsurprisingly, archives also offer a wealth of information for provenance researchers. For example, like other institutions in the 20th century, the Brooklyn Museum sponsored archaeological excavations abroad. These excavations were authorized by foreign governments according to a system known as partage, wherein the source nation would get first pick of the finds and a certain percentage of the finds, and the sponsoring institution would divide the remainder amongst themselves. Excavation reports and illustrations help us to corroborate an Antiquities find site, which is also known as provenience. And lucky for us, the Egypt Exploration Society, with whom we partnered in the early 1900s, has digitized many of their early excavation records online in Flickr albums. Now, I will say not all excavation records offer such a pristine one-to-one matchup of illustrations to archaeological finds. But because archaeologists tend to be very precise about things like dimensions and materials, the records are invaluable for corroborating provenance information even decades after the act of excavation. So one common misconception I hear a lot is that because museums keep robust documentation, they must know everything about their collections. And in reality, your knowledge is only as good as the information available to you. So take these sandals, for example. For years in the museum, they had no documented provenance or even an accession record. But one day while looking in the archives, admittedly for a different object, I came across this letter. Now, this is a letter from a British dealer to our then curator offering a number of works for sale. And the list contains an illustration of the sandals. And it also describes an inscription that, you can't see it in the photo, but on the underneath of the sandals is the inscription that's described in this letter. So from this piece of correspondence, we now know that these sandals were in William Oldman's collection in 1923. They were offered to the museum in November of that year and were acquired by the museum at a later date. So this has given us a place to start looking for further provenance information back in time a project that is ongoing. Photographs are also of great utility to corroborate provenance information. So the work on the right came to the museum as a gift of the Ralph and Fanny Ellison Charitable Trust. And this is Ralph Ellison, the famous author of The Invisible Man and many other works. So the executors of the trust were dispersing the Ellisons' collection 20 years after Ralph's death and 9 years after Fanny's. The executors had no information about the Ellisons collecting and had no records for the works. However, this photograph was taken for a magazine article that shows a number of works in the collection at the time, including this one. So although we don't know precisely when the Ellisons acquired the work, this photo corroborates that it had in fact been in their collection since 1972, shortening our provenance gap by 22 years. Now, I want to say that not all documentation is physical or written. At the Brooklyn Museum, we give oral history and anecdotal information the same way as written documentation. So when researching works sold or donated from people who are still living, we make a point to gather as many recollections as we can. And we especially make a point to preserve oral history when we're researching works from communities who have historically relied on oral record keeping. So here is an example of a recent acquisition of a Haudenosaunee bag and the story and genealogical information that accompanied it. And finally, we also need to rely on the expertise of people outside of the museum, including community members, scholars, and other experts to fill in the gaps of our research. As recently as this past December, we learned from Maori scholar Deirdre Brown that this work arrived in London 135 years earlier than our records had previously indicated. The giveaway for Brown was the carved 9 on the back of this object's head, which identified the work as one of 18 wooden carvings collected in New Zealand by missionary Thomas Kendall for the Church Missionary Society in London, all of which have carved numbers on the reverse. So because Brown's research has indicated that many of these other works in the group were sold through 2 specific British dealers, I'm now looking into the records of those dealers to hopefully close the provenance gaps even further. So one of the most crucial aspects of provenance research is to critically question what might have been omitted from or embellished in records. You know, I know there are some of my provenance colleagues in the call. We are constantly discovering stories whose details are difficult or impossible to verify. For example, this Egyptian statue was sold in 1841 as, quote, one of the 7 objects of antiquity brought from Egypt to France by General Bonaparte. Now, generations of curatorial researchers have tried to corroborate this information to no avail. It is certainly possible that this was once in Napoleon and Josephine's collection, but it is just as possible that the narrative was fabricated in order to fetch a higher price at auction. So we do know from other provenance research that this work has been in the US since at least 1865, but we need to read between the lines of documentation, mindful of the potential biases of a source's time, place, and circumstance. So it's a provenance researcher's responsibility to acknowledge both what we know and what we don't know, and to document those stories as transparently as possible. So at the Brooklyn Museum, for example, we're aiming for transparency in our provenance narratives. Here is one of our collection objects, online collection records. And as you can see, there's a provenance narrative. Admittedly, it's very long, and I'm going to tell you why. So in these narratives, if, for example, we don't have a find site for the antiquity, we'll acknowledge that the archaeological provenance is not yet documented. And the yet here is actually doing a fair amount of work, because we want to be clear that just because the museum doesn't know of documentation, it doesn't mean that the information doesn't exist somewhere in the world. So when we don't know the method of transfer, we'll use the words acquired by instead of more precise terms like purchased, sold, gifted, or bequeathed. We'll also use the terms reportedly, possibly, and probably to indicate varying levels of confidence in our information. And when there's a gap in provenance, we call it out rather than reduce it to the typographical shorthand of semicolons and periods more commonly seen in provenance entries. So our use of these terms, as well as our approach to provenance research, is available via every object record through this FAQ button. But the reason we're all here is the question of how provenance research intersects with legal and ethical issues of collections management. Of the many legal aspects that intersect with provenance research, including contracts, tax, trust and estates, non-for-profit governance, intellectual property, and data privacy law, by far the most important is corroborating title. And although I attempt to do this for every object, there are three main groups of works that, due to the nature of historical collecting practices, take the highest priority for research. So the first group of objects that we prioritize at the Brooklyn Museum are antiquities and protected heritage. This is a high priority, particularly because if evidence suggests that a work was looted from an archaeological site or exported without proper permission, a number of state or federal laws might mandate its return to its country of origin. But from an ethical standpoint, our visitors also want to be assured that the works they see when they come into the building aren't tainted. So in an ideal world, we would be able to say when and how each object in our collection left its country of origin. The best circumstances of removal today, for the most part, are, government-sponsored excavations that allowed some works to leave the country. But most museums, and especially American museum collections, were formed well after their European counterparts and largely through gifts from private collectors and purchases from the art market. So as a result, most objects traveled through private hands before reaching their museum homes. And unfortunately, many sellers did not share provenance information with buyers. Many collectors did not keep detailed records about the provenance of the works in their possession, and many former museum staff chose not to ask probing provenance questions. So one of the most common questions that our staff get from visitors as young as 6 are, was this stolen? And I'll say up front that the Brooklyn Museum's policies, it's against the Brooklyn Museum's policies to collect, hold, or acquire any works that have been stolen. And if we discover or have reason to suspect that a work has been stolen, the museum works in good faith to transfer the work to its relevant heirs, beneficiaries, or communities. However, this question can't always be answered and almost always requires certain in-depth provenance research. So when conducting provenance research for any foreign object, one of the first questions that I ask is, did this leave its country of origin prior to the onset of national patrimony laws and or with proper permission? So as I'm sure many of you know, national patrimony laws form the patchwork of international agreements, domestic laws, and international and institutional best practices that protect antiquities and cultural heritage. Specifically, national patrimony laws protect historical material culture by vesting title to certain categories of objects in the state and limiting or banning their export, removal, or destruction. So in the case of this work, we know that it was excavated in Sitio Conte, Panama in 1931 by Harvard archaeologists with permission from the Panamanian government. The Brooklyn Museum purchased the work from the Harvard Peabody Museum in 1933. And so a lot of people also like to ask me, how are you supposed to keep track of all of these different countries' patrimony laws? And in order to do so, I actually personally keep a spreadsheet of countries' laws, the bilateral agreements, import restrictions, and periods of conflict that it's essentially my way of keeping track of the various dates after which a lack of provenance should be raising red flags. So this is just a snapshot of my kind of personal database that I created, but I will say that this database was created based off of the fantastic resources available for free by the UNESCO database of National Cultural Heritage Laws and by subscription through the IFAR database. So antiquities provenance research is complicated by centuries or even millennia of inscrutable history. Many ancient works were moved to different geographic locations in antiquity before they were discovered by modern archaeologists. And so for antiquities, unless you're dealing with archaeological elements, it's almost impossible to trace a work's provenance back to its maker. Instead, we try to corroborate that an antiquity had left its country of origin prior to the onset of national patrimony laws. So the museum purchased this work, for example, in 1950, well after Mexico had patrimony laws on the books. However, Provenance Research determined that it was published in 1844, the same year that the collector, Benjamin Moore Norman, donated the work to the New York Historical Society. So in 1950, the Brooklyn Museum purchased this work from the New York Historical Society when they were shifting their institutional mission away from global history and toward New York history. And they gave us, among other things, a copy of this publication and documentation that this work has actually been in the US since 1842. So thankfully, collectors of antiquities going back centuries have often been interested in provenance. In the past, proof of provenance could give a work legitimacy and prestige, and connecting it to a famous collection meant that it could fetch a higher price if and when the owner decided to sell it. So this work and its provenance was first published in 1817 by Sir John Cogill. Cogill had inherited it from Jean Gerardo de Rossi, who had had this illustration made sometime before 1817. Now, de Rossi had told Cogill that the work was found near Agrigento in Sicily, but we have yet to find any documentation to corroborate that attribution. But further provenance information and research has corroborated that this vessel was sold in 1874. Although we have not yet been able to find more information about who the owner was or how, when, and from whom they acquired the work. So this means that we have a gap between 1817 and 1874. Now we know from receipts that the Brooklyn Museum purchased this work in January of 1909 from Henri de Morgan, but that means we have yet another gap between 1874 and 1909. So this is fairly typical for a provenance narrative. From it, we know that we have good title because the work is documented to have been outside of Italy well before the passage of any patrimony law, but questions still remain about where the work was in the near century between its publication and its purchase. So another unfortunately common provenance narrative is having no documented history prior to the work's arrival at the museum. So this work was loaned to the Brooklyn Museum in December of 1970. The lender, Arthur Sackler, told us that he had purchased it from Nuri Fahari and Habib Anavian, but either the museum did not ask Sackler for further information or did not follow up with the dealers because we have no prior provenance in our records. So in 2015, curators debated and finally decided to acquire this work because scholarship indicated that it had probably been outside of Iran, its country of modern discovery, prior to 1970, and thus complied with the Association of Art Museum Directors acquisition guidelines for antiquities. But because this work lacks documented provenance before it entered the museum, it has been posted to the AAMD object registry. So for those unfamiliar, this is a public registry of works that American museums have acquired without documentation prior to November 1970, which is the date of the famous 1970 UNESCO convention. Now, the lawyers in the room might be bristling that the cutoff date for this registry is 1970, because many in the museum world mistakenly believe that if an object has documented provenance before November of 1970, a museum has clear title. As mentioned earlier, the true cutoff date is the applicable national patrimony law of its country of modern discovery. In this case, Iran's 1930 patrimony law. So as a provenance researcher, this is what we're grappling with. I'm hoping to one day find more information about this work's ownership prior to 1970 and ideally prior to 1930. But until then, it's part of our policy that we post such works to the object registry as a way to be transparent about what we know and don't know about the work, and to make sure that the information is available to anybody who might be looking for it. So the second main category of works that we prioritize for provenance research are those that might have been affected by spoliation policies during World War II. So I'm sure you're all aware that one of the many atrocities the Nazi government committed while in power was systematically dispossessing Jews of their citizenship and legal rights, including property rights. Jewish art collectors had their collections confiscated and dealers had their stock seized, but the scope of dispossession didn't just involve the wealthy, nor did it involve valuable works of European masters or so-called degenerate art. The Nazis and their sympathizers used many means to dispossess Jews of all of their belongings, regardless of their socioeconomic status. They confiscated not just people's art, but their furniture, their silverware, china, books, religious belongings, etc. And sometimes this took the form of confiscating belongings as people were ejected from their homes, but disposition also took the form of forced sales or sales under duress. So this is where even ostensibly voluntary sales occurred against the backdrop of systemic dispossession and genocide. For example, many Jews had to sell their belongings in order to pay punitive taxes imposed on them in order to emigrate from the country. So although many works have been restituted to victims or their heirs, many, many more likely reside in museum collections. So as a provenance researcher, one of my highest research priorities is to try to resolve gaps for works that were plausibly in Europe between 1933 and 1945. Thankfully, tons of documentation has been preserved from this period, documenting what was confiscated, from whom, where it was stored, etc. But searching records for confiscation is much easier for works that have a title or have been attributed to an artist than, for example, for decorative arts and furniture. But many challenges still persist for provenance researchers. So a named artist may have something that's called a catalogue raisonné. These are compilations of an artist's oeuvre, documenting the work's provenance, its publication and exhibition history, and any specific information about the work. So catalogue raisonné are great for corroborating provenance of unique works like paintings, but they're frankly yet less useful for works that were created as one in a series, like prints. So the work on the right, as a unique and identifiable painting, actually has a complete provenance narrative. This painting was left to the artist's family following his death in 1894. It was consigned by his heirs to a gallery and purchased by a private collector who bequeathed it to the Brooklyn Museum and received it on his death in 1992. The two prints, however, are more difficult to track. By nature of their medium, prints are one in a series of near identical works. Sometimes prints will include an identifying number, like 10 out of 100, but more often there are no identifying features to distinguish one print from any of the others made in a series. So both of these images, for example, appear in their respective artist's catalogue raisonné, but those records only exist for the series and not for the individual copies within it. So the serial nature of prints makes tracking provenance for individual works nearly impossible. So despite our best efforts, we're not sure we'll ever be able to resolve the World War II era provenance gaps of these two works. But what we can do is publish them with as transparent provenance information as possible. So for someone like me, there are a few things I look for when doing provenance research of works with gaps during the Nazi era. One thing I look for is red flag names. This includes names of individuals known to have had works confiscated, of individuals known who have been part of confiscation projects, or of dealers who are known to have sold works later discovered to have been confiscated. So this work, for example, was sold by an Egyptian dealer who had permission from the Egyptian government to sell antiquities. It changed hands between a few dealers, but eventually came into the possession of Moish Levi de Benzian. So Levi de Benzian was a Jewish collector and a dealer who had galleries in both Paris and in Cairo. During the war, he and his wife fled to the south of France, but his Paris stock was seized by Nazi agents. Because the Nazis never made it to Egypt, his Cairo stock remained untouched. So Moish died in 1943, but everything known to have been confiscated from his Paris gallery was restituted to his widow in 1946. And then in 1947, she sold most of the Cairo stock at auction. Neither the Nazi confiscation records nor the 1947 Cairo sale catalog go into very much depth about the Egyptian antiquities from Levi de Benzian's collection. And there are no photographs we have found to corroborate whether this was part of his Cairo or his Paris stock. So in 1953, the Brooklyn Museum purchased this from Mrs. Levi de Benzian, so we can be pretty confident that we have good title to the work, but there's still an open question about whether this was confiscated by Nazi agents or not. And for those familiar with the recently passed New York law, there's a question about whether this work would fall under the law requiring museums to publish to have specific labels calling out works that were known to have been confiscated or sold under duress. So sometimes red flag names turn up different stories than you were anticipating. When I was doing research on our European art collection, I was looking for some of the known collaborators in the Nazi confiscation project, and it came across this work, which had the name Hans Wendland. Wendland was a notorious member of the Nazi Party who confiscated a lot of works from Jewish collectors in the World War II era. But this work actually came to the Brooklyn Museum in 1923. So this is well before World War II. But the more research I did into Wendland, I realized that the circumstances of this sale actually are related to a different period of confiscation. So Wendland, during the outbreak of World War I, went back to Germany. He had been living in Paris for a while, but he had a home in Berlin. And depending on whose version of history you believe, he was either conscripted or volunteered to join the German army. And one of his roles during World War I was to assess Parisian collections of art that were going to be confiscated for the German government. So following World War I, Paris, as retribution and restitution for the looting that Wendland and a couple of others had been responsible for, sold his entire sale of work that was in his Paris estate. And that was the sale that the Brooklyn Museum purchased this work from. So this is just an example of, there are other periods of looting beyond World War II that are just as, or maybe not just as egregious, but have the same kind of cast of shady characters. And it's yet another reason why, I also keep a list of red flag names where if I see them, I'm going to dig a little deeper. But besides red flag names, sometimes we'll also look for red flag periods. So this work, for example, was exhibited in Buffalo in December of 1940. And the exhibition catalog claims that the collection had been in France until the summer of 1940 when it was acquired by George Frederick Keller. Now, anyone who knows World War II history will know that Germany invaded France in the summer of 1940. So this work's lack of documented provenance before that period means that we're uncertain whether this might have been sold under duress. So like other works with Nazi-era gaps, at the Brooklyn Museum, we are doing our best to make sure this information is publicly available on our website. So I know I'm running a little short on time. I'll just quickly address that we cannot discuss provenance with also acknowledging the extent to which historical collecting has been embedded within projects of colonialism and imperialism. So our third priority for research contains objects acquired during colonial contexts, following armed conflicts, or otherwise acquired during circumstances that may have involved duress. So it's notable that American museums began collecting art when much of the world was under colonial occupation. This map shows a brief snapshot of some of those colonial histories. So objects may have left their countries of origin for various reasons. Some were created specifically for a market, but many others probably left under circumstances we would consider illegal or unethical today. And the long shadows of that history require us to examine the provenance a little more closely. So one of the most significant acquisitions of the Brooklyn Museums was in 1923, when its curator purchased roughly 900 objects from what was then termed the Belgian Congo. Cullen acquired these works wholesale from a dealer in Brussels named Francois Poncelet, and here are some of those works. Now, diligent provenance research has not been able to identify how Poncelet acquired these works, but their presence in Brussels at the height of Belgium's colonial occupation of the Congo is illustrative of their potential histories. So the museum is currently working with communities in Africa to try to determine more information about these works in the hopes that it will lead to more information about how and when they left. And I think, maybe I'll just end here that it's worth noting that unlike their counterparts in other parts of the world, African cultural heritage has lacked legal protection until very recently. And this is because most cultural patrimony laws of formerly colonized nations were only created recently following independence. So because international law has not recognized pre-colonial ownership laws, many museums have begun considering repatriation according to ethical rather than legal parameters. I had a couple more examples of some of the works that we're considering, but I think I might just leave it there because I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing and I welcome any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Megan, for such a fantastic presentation and a really in-depth overview of all of the work that you do. I'm sure The audience really, really appreciates it. And we do have a good few questions that have been coming in. And I think one of the first ones, more with regard to your background, while working in provenance and working in museums, how come you decided to pursue a law degree in the process?
Yeah, so I mean, I think of there are lots of aspects of museum work where law is adjacent, but I think provenance, especially in the contemporary climate, is one in which we're seeing a lot of overlap between interest in ownership disputes, in interest in provenance for ownership disputes, and the museum's real need to understand what the legal landscape is. So, full transparency, I went to law school because I saw a gap in those two communities kind of talking to each other. There aren't a lot of people who work for museums who understand the legal landscape of cultural heritage law. But on the flip side, there aren't a lot of lawyers who really understand the kind of on the ground realities of what it is to work at a museum. So I saw this kind of this gap in those communities talking to each other. And we're also in a moment where the landscape of what can be repatriated and restituted and who can claim ownership over material culture is dramatically shifting. So it seemed like the right call. And, even though working full time while also going to school is a lot, I have not regretted my decision.
Love that. Thank you so much. Another question that I feel like you've kind of mentioned, but we're hoping to maybe have more of an answer on is how the museum handles artworks with controversial provenance and what steps are usually taken to engage with the public on these matters.
Sure. So, I mean, I hope the presentation kind of showed that controversial can mean a lot of things. So, if we discover provenance information that suggests something was illegally exported, that fast tracks us through a legal process pretty quickly. We work with legal counsel, and depending on the nature of the information, we might reach out to the State Department of the country or reach out to law enforcement or in some way, try to expedite making sure that the people who need to know about it are notified. For, other works that don't necessarily fall under strict legal mandates for what to do, for example, colonial era works, it's more of an open question. So, for all the research that we do, the Brooklyn Museum is trying really hard to publish its provenance online. And if the object is going on view, we put provenance on its labels. But also, if we discover something that one of the objects that was going to share may have been taken out of burial contexts in a nation in the Pacific. So it doesn't necessarily fall under US law for repatriation, but it's not the kind of thing that the museum would ever display or even want to keep in its collection. So in that kind of circumstance, we would reach out to either museum colleagues we know in the country or community representatives that we have connections to, and just honestly say, hey, we found out this information. We wanted to let you know if there's something that you would like us to do, or if you want to move forward in seeking, to have us return this, we'll do it. So, if there's a third thing that I want everyone to take away, it's that honestly, no two provenance research projects are the same. Every work is hyper unique. And so the response needs to be hyper unique as well. But we try, I would say there was a slide that I was going to show. Transparency and accessibility along with diligence are values that we try to emulate at the museum. So trying to be transparent about what we know, trying to make that information as accessible as possible, and on the back end, trying to be as diligent as possible and research from as many possible kind of angles and avenues that we can.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I know we have many, many questions coming in, so we'll try to cover as many of these as we can. We're also wondering if maybe you can speak a little bit more with regard to the restitution efforts of the museum, especially once again when there are claims related to disputed provenance. And another half of this is, do you think that the 2021 New York law requiring museums to post notice when displaying art that was stolen in Europe during the Nazi era, is it going to contribute to restitution efforts as well?
Okay, two big questions. I am remembering the second question, so I'm going to address that now, and then I'll revisit or maybe ask about the other one. So the 2021 law, I think a lot of people, both in the legal field and in the museum field, realize that the way the law was written we're not quite sure what it was hoping to accomplish other than awareness. So for those who aren't aware, New York State passed a law mandating that museums that have works that are known to have been confiscated or sold under duress are so labeled whenever they're put on view. Now, the reality is that if a museum knows that something was confiscated or sold under duress, chances are, I'd say 9.5 times out of 10, that work was restituted to its heirs before it came to the museum, because that's how we know. I'd say the bigger proportion of works that, might have Nazi era problems, part of the reason they have problems is that we don't actually have proof that they were confiscated. We just have endless series of questions. So I don't necessarily think the law is probably going to do much to facilitate restitution, just because it's really only mandating that museums acknowledge what they already know. I think there is a question of, what constitutes duress that, people will disagree about. For the Brooklyn Museum, thankfully, to our knowledge, we don't actually have anything in the collection that we know was confiscated, but the Levi de Benzian object is a perfect example of, we don't know that this was confiscated. It could have been confiscated. In any case, it was restituted. If it was confiscated, it's a series of question marks. So unfortunately, I don't think the law as written will do a lot to facilitate restitution. But I think it is indicative of the need and the kind of public consciousness of continued attention to Nazi era provenance gaps nearly a century after the beginning of the Nazi era. If I'm remembering correctly, I think the earlier question was about how do we approach restitution for work? Okay.
And very similar to, I'm so sorry, there's
Sure.
another question that's very similar to, suppose you've identified that a work has been acquired under duress. What would you do after that? Do you stop the research and deaccession? Do you continue working on the earlier provenance to identify its origin? So it's a bit intertwined, and I know it's a very long and loaded question once more.
Yeah. Um, I hate to pull the classic lawyerly, it depends, but it earnestly and honestly depends. So, if we uncover evidence that something might have been, let's say, confiscated during World War II, if we, have a name of an heir, then we can, reach it. There are plenty of people in the world who are working with heirs, heirs of victims of the Nazi period, that are trying to reunite families with their descendants' lost artworks. So, if we have a name to go on, we'll follow up on that. I think what's a lot more common is, you might find a red flag name, but then you have a gap after that red flag name. And then you're just wondering, well, what does this mean? So, this is part of why I said earlier that provenance research is always ongoing, is, we're constantly trying to piece together as much information as we can. But in terms of, moving toward restitution, again, it really depends. If there's a work that we, think might have been acquired in a colonial period under duress, let's say something was taken from the house of a chief and taken by a collector under the dead of night or whatever. That's the kind of thing that, even if the law today wouldn't mandate restitution, we would consider that to be unethical and ill-gotten. So that's the kind of circumstance where we might reach out to the contemporary community authorities, be that tribal governments or community organizations or nonprofits or NGOs, to try to figure out what might be the best wishes of the community. What can get really tricky really quickly is that it's not always obvious who are the right authorities to be making these calls. I was going to talk a little bit about the Benin Kingdom, but that's a great example of, you have multiple claimants. You have the Nigerian government that has claimed ownership over Benin Kingdom Antiquities. You have the Oba, who has claimed personal ownership over everything that was taken in 1897. We're seeing now lawsuits from descendants of enslaved Africans. And I heard just the other day a potential lawsuit from descendants of enslaved miners who mined the ore that was shipped and sold for the people who were enslaved. And then that ore was then made into the works. So it can get really, really complicated. And this is frankly another reason why I wanted to go to law school is I think if I were to make any kind of prediction about the future of restitution, I think we're going to see a lot more, maybe not less litigation, but I think we're going to be seeing a lot more kind of methods of alternative dispute resolution. So, mediation and negotiation, because so many of these, questions that are dealing with some of the deep sins of world history, colonialism and slavery and war and genocide, there aren't easy answers when it comes to reparations. There aren't easy answers when it comes to who should be the claimant and descendant communities that can claim ownership. So, this is all this is to say is that it gets really complicated. And, what we try to do when we're navigating these discussions is making sure that we are involving as many stakeholders that need to be at the table as we can. And then just earnestly listening to those stakeholders. So, yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Thank you so much. Another couple of questions. How do you approach post-war contemporary provenance research where there are issues of confidentiality that have to be considered?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I started in this capacity at the museum, we were mandating that all works that go on view are going to have their provenance documented, and that all works coming in, we were already asking for provenance for new acquisitions for things like antiquities, but we now require every work that comes into the museum having documented provenance. So admittedly, some of our contemporary curators were like, what do you mean you want provenance? So this is something that we now work into all of our either terms of sale or gift agreements, that the provenance information be part of what we ask for when we're acquiring something. So usually when we're publishing provenance, if it's a gift, unless it's an anonymous gift and there are like contractual reasons why something might be anonymous, unless it's an anonymous gift, there's something called a credit line on an object that will show who gave the work. And so the provenance there is pretty easy to do, especially when we're talking about the post-war period. There isn't a lot of information. There isn't a lot of opportunity for, lots and lots and lots of exchanges. And a lot of that information is already public knowledge. So, sales of works in the 60s and 70s, there are auction catalogs that exist out there. But yeah, the question of anonymity is one that comes up occasionally. Usually it's kind of up to the curator to talk to the donor or the vendor and let them know that it's part of our process to put provenance on the labels. Occasionally we will, instead of identifying a specific collector on the public-facing label, we will say like a New York collector or a Paris gallery, and that will be for public-facing information. But we will retain that information in more full provenance statements kind of on the back end. And that's, again, more of a case-by-case basis. But yeah, I admittedly don't know a whole lot about data privacy. So that's another kind of thing where if we have a question about it, we'll kind of run that up the flagpole to our legal counsel and ask their opinions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We have a few more questions, and I'm wondering, Megan, is it okay if we maybe go a few minutes beyond
Sure.
one? Thank you. And the session is being recorded, so in case anyone has to leave promptly at 1, no worries, we'll send a recording to you. But it is very interesting to tune into Megan responding live with these answers. Another question we had is if you could speak a little bit more regarding ethical repatriation. And an example is where a work in a collection doesn't have documented history prior to 1970. And last year, the Smithsonian adopted an ethical return policy where it has a legal title to an object. So they're wondering if you could comment on this trend of ethical repatriation and how museums should balance legal and ethical concerns. It seems to be a little difficult to come up with bright line rules for this.
Yeah, it's a great question and a very pressing question. Personally, with full disclosure, I'm not a huge fan of bright line rules. I kind of live in the weeds and in the gray area between things. But I think, so the Smithsonian's policy is excellent. We have used both that policy as well as a number of other policies. The Art Council of the United Kingdom also published a guide for ethical repatriations. A number of other European institutions, I think the German Museums Association and the Netherlands Museum Association have published guidelines for dealing specifically with works acquired during colonial contexts. So this is absolutely, very much at the forefront of a lot of museum practitioners. The Brooklyn Museum does have part of its collection policy that we will consider ethical repatriations on a case-by-case basis. We're actually working right now on rewriting some of those policies to better reflect the reality. But in general, I think the way a lot of museums who are taking these issues seriously are going to be, as I said earlier, trying to figure out who are the stakeholders, trying to make sure that the stakeholders who might be claiming the works in question have the authority to do so, not necessarily the legal authority to do so, according to is this the state government representative? But, let's say it's a tribal community. We want to make sure that the claim might be coming from representatives of the native nation and not somebody who's acting without nation's authority. So, making sure that you're talking to the people who actually have authority to be making a claim, making sure that you are considering anybody else who might have a stake in that claim, when it comes to, let's say, Indigenous repatriations from Canada, from the Northwest Coast, there could be a couple of different tribal nations that might have a stake in something that is just listed in our database as Northwest Coast. So we would, need to spend some time figuring out, is this Haida, is this Tlingit, is this Kwakwaka'wakw? And then within that, what is the kind of intertribal delineation? So it's what I can say is it's a very long process. I think, the media like to show this as this is all happening right now. In 10 to 20 years, we're going to see museums evacuated of all their collections. I don't think that's true. I think, what's really crucial right now to the projects of ethical repatriations is the relationship building that goes along with it. So, museums have a lot of works in their collection that they're caring for, and no one person can be an expert. So I think, building networks of researchers, building networks with communities is really crucial to making sure that if and when works are returned, that they are done so as respectfully and informed as possible.
Thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions regarding any litigation that you're aware of, either by descendants against museums where provenance appears to favor a stolen work, and if you've ever had to navigate competing restitution claims.
Well, I'll say that the Brooklyn Museum has never had a restitution claim for a World War II era work. So we don't necessarily have anything that I can think of that is related to any litigations. Can you repeat the first part of that question?
Sure. The question is if you're aware of any litigation of descendants against museums where the provenance appears to favor a stolen work.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm not quite sure what appears to favor a stolen work might mean in this context, but I think especially when it comes to World War II era repatriations, there are laws now that there was in 2016 there was the HERE Act that was passed, which extended statutes of limitations for claimants to bring ownership claims over works. So we're starting to see some of those HERE Act claims be litigated in the courts now. But part of the problem of litigating ownership disputes when the time period in which a work might have been confiscated or stolen was marked by, death and destruction from war is a lot of those records might not exist anymore. The people who might have been able to give us answers might have died. There's a real evidentiary burden upon those who are trying to prove that something was confiscated that unfortunately makes it kind of difficult for claims to be litigated in courts. It's not to say that there aren't restitution success stories in the courts, but I think it's pretty it's indicative that a lot of these disputes get settled out of court, which is the reason why I kind of predicted earlier that I think, other means of dispute resolution are probably, we're going to see a lot more of those going forward, just because, museums are starting to recognize that just because something isn't legally mandated for restitution or return doesn't mean that a museum might not, a museum might still want to return something. And so that is because there's no law mandating it. There doesn't need to be a lawsuit, but there can be a conversation and a negotiated agreement with the parties via settlement or any other kind of process.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And finally, I think just to conclude, there are a couple of questions regarding your career and how you got into the field, and if you have any advice or if you can identify any points of entry into the field of provenance research. And second to that, as a law student, are there any subjects that you've taken which have been very helpful while working in provenance research?
Yeah, great questions. So I'll also just say to the Center for Art Law folks, I have my email up on the screen. So please, if you're interested in following up with me, don't be shy. I love talking to people about career trajectories and all these things. But me personally, I actually don't have an art history background. I came to the museum world by way of anthropology. So I got a master's in museum anthropology because it was the time where if you wanted to get your foot in the door to a museum, you needed a master's degree in something. So my interest was really in how museums can better engage with Indigenous nations on not just potential repatriation, but care of existing collections according to Indigenous community wishes. So that was my interest. I started at the museum as a curatorial assistant for African, Pacific, Asian, and Islamic collections. And so in that capacity, as kind of part admin assistant, part research assistant, I really got to know the collection well. And so, this is a through line that I see for a lot of provenance researchers. There are not a lot of dedicated provenance research positions at museums. That's changing. There are a lot more positions coming up on the market, but a lot of people who do provenance research in museums do it while working in other capacities. So they might be working in curatorial departments or registrar departments or collections management departments, and provenance research is one of the many things that they do. So, there are lots of different entry points to provenance research. I think, for those who are interested in working in museums, a research background, knowing how to read primary sources kind of and to distill that information is really crucial. It definitely doesn't hurt to have a few languages. If you want to do World War II era research, it'd be great to know both French and German. I read French, I don't read German. It's often a problem for me. Or if you want to do research in any of the other collecting fields, having a couple of languages under your belt is really great. But I would also say, don't be, if you're interested in provenance research, don't be disheartened if there aren't positions out there that have provenance research exactly in their ambit, because provenance research really is a collective effort at museums. As I said earlier, I can't know everything, so I rely on a lot of my other colleagues to help do this research. So registrar departments, curatorial departments, research departments, collections management, and conservation are all really good ways to get into the museum world. In terms of law, obviously the key subjects of property law is going to be really, really crucial, which I think every 1L has to take. Classes that I've found really useful are international law, trusts and estates, tax law. As much as everybody kind of groans, tax law is really at the heart of a lot of gifts. And let's see what else. I'm taking a class right now on reparations, which is great for kind of wrapping your head around conceptualizing how one might go about, negotiating potential disputes. I think any practice in mediation, negotiation, arbitration work would be really great. But the great thing about art law is that people who practice art law get to wear a lot of hats. And so, there's no one track for art law. So I'd say, from my experience, even if a class is not exactly on brand for the kind of work I want to do, you'll have things like research papers that you can kind of dedicate to diving into the one specific area that you're interested in. So, yeah, those are some of the classes that I would highly suggest that have been really helpful for me.
Thank you so much, Megan. There are other questions, but I will share your email address if that's okay in the chat and in the follow-up email as well. But we really can't thank you enough. This was such a incredibly insightful presentation and so many examples and stories, and we really appreciate you taking the time and answering all of the questions that came in. We appreciate it, and we really look forward to hopefully working with you soon again. Thank you.
Thank you again. I was happy to do this, and I look forward, hopefully, to doing more in the future.
Thank you. Take care. And to all of the participants, thank you for attending. The handout and materials, the recording of the session will be sent to you. We have shared an exit survey in the chat, and I'll share that by email as well. It would be wonderful if you could take a few minutes and fill out the exit survey to let us know your thoughts about today's session and let us know what you'd like the center to cover and talk about in 2024. We have a lot of plans, but we would love to hear from you as well. So thank you for attending, and thank you once again, Megan. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.